My name is Hailey, 31 years old, and I work as a financial auditor for a corporate firm in Chicago. After years of grueling 70-hour work weeks, I finally bought my dream property. It was a stunning 5-bedroom lake house in Lake Geneva, Wisconsin. I invited my parents and my sister's family up for a small housewarming weekend. I almost choked when my sister pointed around my new living room and told my 7-year-old niece that one day this entire house would be hers. I watched as my mother turned to me with a smug smile like it was already a settled legal agreement. So I set my drink down and said clearly, "Since when do you have a say about my house?" Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic relatives who tried to claim what you worked hard for. I sacrificed almost every single weekend to climb the corporate ladder. The lake property had floor-to-ceiling windows, a wraparound deck, and a private dock. I was so very proud of this milestone. I hoped the beautiful setting would bring us together. Instead, it became the moment my family decided they were entitled to my labor. The evening had started off tense but manageable. I had spent all afternoon cooking a massive dinner for everyone. My mother Diane sat on the expensive leather sofa I had just purchased, silently judging the decor. My father Richard sat quietly beside her, nodding whenever she made a passive-aggressive comment about how far away the house was from their home in Chicago. My sister Brittany and her husband Jamal were lounging by the stone fireplace. Jamal is an imposing African-American man who always uses his physical presence and flashy designer clothes to intimidate people. He was wearing a watch that caught the firelight, loudly bragging about his latest vague business ventures. I was in the kitchen slicing a pie for dessert when I heard Brittany call her daughter Kinsley over to the large picture windows. "Look around, sweetie," Brittany said, her voice carrying perfectly across the open floor plan. "One day this whole house will be yours. You can have the big bedroom upstairs with the balcony for your playroom." I froze with the knife in my hand. I stepped out of the kitchen, expecting my mother to correct her. Instead, Diane smiled warmly at my niece and nodded in agreement. "Yes, Kinsley," Diane said. "It will be the perfect summer home for our family. You will grow up swimming right off that dock." The sheer audacity paralyzed me. They were talking about my home, the property I had just closed on with my own money, as if I had already died and left it to them in a will. Or worse, as if I had bought it exclusively for their benefit. I set the knife down on the counter. My pulse was pounding in my ears, but I forced my voice to remain completely steady as I walked into the living room. "Since when do you have a say about my house?" I asked, looking directly at my mother and my sister. The room went dead silent. Kinsley looked up at me, sensing the sudden shift in the atmosphere, and quickly ran over to sit next to her father. Diane did not even have the decency to look embarrassed. She took a slow sip of her wine and crossed her legs, looking at me with cold calculation. "Oh, Hailey, do not be so dramatic," Diane said, waving her hand dismissively. "We are simply being practical. You are a single woman. You have no husband and no children. What are you going to do with a 5-bedroom lake house by yourself? It is a waste of space." "A complete waste of space," I repeated, my voice rising slightly. "I bought this house with my own money. I saved for years. I earned all my bonuses. I do not have to justify how many bedrooms I want in my own home." Brittany scoffed loudly from the fireplace. She crossed her arms and glared at me. "You are being completely selfish, Hailey. You know Jamal and I have been looking for a vacation property for Kinsley. Growing kids really need space to run around and experience nature. It makes perfect sense for this to become a family asset. We are your family, or did you forget that fact the moment you got your big corporate promotion?" I stared at my older sister in absolute disbelief. "You want a vacation home," I said. "Then you and Jamal can go buy one. You two constantly brag about your expensive lifestyle, and Jamal is always talking about his massive business deals. Go buy your own lake house." Jamal walked toward me with a condescending smirk on his face. "You just do not get it, do you?" Jamal said, his voice dripping with arrogance. "Wealth is about building a family legacy. But you would not know anything about that because you are just a selfish spinster focused on climbing a corporate ladder. This house should be put into a family trust. We can all use it. Brittany and I can bring Kinsley up here for the summers, and your parents can use it for their retirement. You can visit on the holidays. I let out a harsh, bitter laugh. Let me make sure I understand this, I said. You want me to take the house that I solely paid for, transfer the deed into a trust that you all control, so you can take free vacations while I continue to pay the mortgage and the property taxes. Exactly, Diane said, her face lighting up. It is the only sensible thing to do. You owe it to this family to share your success. We raised you. Now it is your turn to give back. We will contact a lawyer on Monday to draft the trust documents. You will sign the deed over, and Brittany and Jamal will get the master suite. I looked at my father, hoping for a single ounce of reason. Dad, are you seriously agreeing with this insanity? I asked. Richard shifted uncomfortably on the leather sofa. Listen to your mother, Hailey, he mumbled weakly. Family needs to share. Do not make this difficult. The betrayal hit me like a physical blow. They had come to my housewarming party not to celebrate my success, but to orchestrate a hostile takeover of my property. They genuinely believed that because I was an unmarried woman without children, my assets were simply up for grabs. I am not signing anything, I said, my voice dropping to an icy whisper. I am not putting my house in a trust. I am not giving you the master bedroom. And I am certainly not paying a mortgage so Jamal can play rich on my dime. This is my house, mine alone. Diane stood up abruptly. Her face turned purple with sudden unhinged rage. She marched across the living room and stopped inches from my face. You listen to me right now. Diane screamed, her voice echoing off the high vaulted ceilings. I am your mother. You will not disrespect me, and you will not disrespect your sister. You will sign this house over to the family trust, or you are not my daughter anymore. If you walk away from this family today, you are dead to us. The ultimatum hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. A few years ago, this threat would have broken me. I had spent my entire life shrinking myself down to make Brittany look bigger. I had spent my entire life craving my mother's approval, an approval that was only ever granted when I was sacrificing my own happiness for her convenience. But standing in the beautiful home I had bought with blood, sweat, and tears, looking at the pure greed twisting my mother's features, the final thread of my familial guilt snapped. I did not cry. I did not scream back. I calmly reached into my back pocket and pulled out my phone. I opened the clock app, set a timer for exactly 15 minutes, and hit start. What are you doing? Brittany demanded, stepping forward with her hands on her hips. I looked directly at my mother, then at my sister and brother-in-law. The timer has started, I said, my voice ringing out clearly in the silent room. You have exactly 15 minutes to pack your bags and get off my property. If you are still standing inside my house when this alarm goes off, I am calling the Lake Geneva Police Department and having you all arrested for trespassing. The room erupted into absolute chaos. Diane began screaming hysterically, calling me a heartless monster. Richard jumped up, but I stepped back. I kept my hand firmly on the heavy brass doorknob, pointing directly at the front exit. The timer on my screen flashed brightly in the dim light of the entryway, counting down the seconds with ruthless precision. My mother shrieked that I was bluffing, that I would never do something so horrific to my own blood. But the moment Jamal grabbed his expensive leather duffel bag and muttered a string of harsh curses, the reality finally set in. They actually had to leave. I watched my family march out into the crisp Wisconsin night air. Brittany carried Kinsley on her hip, whispering loudly about how her mean aunt was a monster who hated them. My father gave me one last look of intense disappointment before shuffling out behind them like a defeated servant. I shut the heavy wooden door, turned the deadbolt until it clicked, and leaned my forehead against the cool glass. The silence that followed was deafening, but it was also the most peaceful moment I had experienced in 31 years. When I woke up the very next morning, that hard-won peace was entirely shattered. The digital assault began before I even had a chance to brew my morning coffee. I unlocked my phone to find 84 unread notifications. My stomach dropped as I opened Facebook. My sister had posted a lengthy, highly dramatized status update, complete with a tearful selfie taken in the passenger seat of Jamal's luxury SUV. The post described in agonizing detail how her unhinged, heartless sister had suffered a psychotic break and thrown her elderly parents and innocent 7-year-old daughter out into the freezing night over a simple misunderstanding. She wrote paragraphs about how she feared for her physical safety, claiming I had violently chased them out of the house. She conveniently left out the part where they ambushed me and demanded I sign over $1 million property to a family trust that they controlled. My mother had already shared the post twice, adding a long comment about how newfound wealth changes people and how she was praying for my corrupted soul. My Instagram was flooded with angry direct messages from cousins I had not spoken to in a decade. One message from my mother's sister accused me of hoarding wealth while my family struggled, stating that my grandfather would be rolling in his grave if he saw how selfish I had become. The sheer volume of the hatred was suffocating. They were actively rallying an online mob to terrorize me into compliance. The smear campaign was highly coordinated and remarkably vicious. My phone vibrated nonstop as the morning dragged on. I received a text from my aunt calling me an absolute disgrace to the family name and warning me that I would burn in hell for disrespecting my mother. A second cousin told me I deserved to die alone and miserable. But the most alarming message came from Jamal. I clicked on a voicemail he had left at 2 in the morning. His voice was dripping with venom as he threatened to sue me. He claimed the sudden eviction had caused severe emotional distress to Kinsley. He said his lawyers would be contacting me for intentional infliction of emotional trauma, and that I was going to pay dearly for disrespecting a man of his stature. He promised to make my life a living nightmare until I handed over the keys to the lake house to make amends. I deleted the voicemail immediately. As a financial auditor, I knew exactly how baseless his legal threats were, but the sheer aggression behind his words proved just how desperate they were to intimidate me into submission. A weaker version of me would have immediately drafted a public response. I would have posted screenshots of the real story, defended my character to the extended family, and begged everyone to understand my side of the conflict. But I knew better than to feed the fire. Engaging with a narcissist publicly only feeds their victim complex and gives them the attention they crave. I refused to play their toxic game online. I systematically blocked my mother, my father, Brittany, and Jamal across all social media platforms. I restricted my privacy settings, silenced my phone, and packed my bags. I locked up the lake house. Entering the security system was fully armed and began the long drive back to Chicago. As the towering city skyline appeared on the horizon, it reminded me of the successful life I had built entirely on my own. I compartmentalized the trauma, forcefully shoving the betrayal into a locked mental box. I had a high-pressure job at a top-tier accounting firm, and I could not afford to let fabricated family drama ruin the career that paid for my freedom. I turned up the radio and let the rhythm of the highway soothe my frayed nerves. I had clawed my way to the top of my department through late nights and sheer determination. I was not going to let them tear down the foundation I had laid for my future. Monday morning arrived with a brutal schedule of corporate client audits, compliance reviews, and financial risk assessments. I threw myself into the spreadsheets, tax codes, and financial disclosures. The precise, logical world of numbers was the perfect antidote to the chaotic, irrational mess of my family. In auditing, everything balances out eventually. Every missing dollar leaves a paper trail. The predictability of the data brought me a profound sense of comfort. By Wednesday afternoon, I almost felt normal again. The sting of the weekend's ambush was fading into the background of my daily routine. I was sitting in a beautiful glass-walled conference room on the 40th floor, leading a highly important meeting with our senior partners and a major corporate banking client. We were in the middle of discussing a complex merger when my desk phone buzzed sharply. I ignored it, but it rang again, and then a third time. I excused myself with a polite apology and answered the call. It was the front desk security guard from the main lobby downstairs. He sounded panicked, telling me there was an older gentleman causing a severe disturbance at the security desk, claiming to be my father, and demanding that I come down immediately. My blood ran cold. The conflict had officially breached my professional boundaries. I excused myself from the executive meeting with a tight smile, keeping my posture rigid and confident as I walked to the elevators. I took the elevator down to the main floor, my heart hammering furiously against my ribs. The polished steel doors slid open to reveal a scene of absolute chaos in the elegant marble lobby. My father Richard was pacing erratically in front of the security turnstiles. He was shouting at the top of his lungs, his face flushed a deep, angry red. Several colleagues from my department and important clients from other firms were standing nearby, watching the spectacle with wide, shocked eyes. As soon as he spotted me stepping out of the elevator, he lunged forward, pushing past a uniformed security guard who tried to block his path. He pointed a shaking finger directly at my face and screamed that I was a horrible, ungrateful daughter. His voice echoed off the high marble ceilings as he demanded that I surrender the lake house immediately. He yelled that I had abandoned my family when they needed me most, and that I was going to apologize to my mother for the pain I had maliciously caused her. He waved a printed document in his hand, shouting that everyone in this building needed to know what a monster they had hired. He claimed I was a thief who stole joy from my own niece. The public humiliation was a calculated, deliberate attack designed to break my spirit in the one place where I felt truly secure and respected. He wanted to shame me into submission right in front of the people who paid my salary. He turned to a group of executives waiting by the reception desk and loudly proclaimed that I was a heartless spinster who hated children. He demanded that human resources come down and fire me. The security guards grabbed his arms to restrain him, but he continued to thrash and kick, screaming my name over and over again. The desperation in his eyes was terrifying, but beneath the fear, a burning anger began to rise in my chest. They had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. My professional sanctuary was tainted. As the head of security looked at me for direction, asking if they should call the Chicago police to have him arrested, I realized ignoring them was no longer an option. I took a deep breath, stepping forward to face the man who was actively trying to destroy my life. I stepped forward, my heels clicking sharply against the polished marble floor. Richard saw me approaching, his eyes lit with a manic gleam. He truly believed cornering me in my corporate headquarters would force my hand. He lunged toward me, breaking free from the security guard. His hand shot out, his fingers digging bruisingly hard into my right forearm. He yanked me toward him, shaking a crumpled piece of paper in my face. "Sign it!" he bellowed, spit flying from his lips. "Sign the apology right now and give me the keys to the lake house. You are going to fix what you broke. You are going to make this right." I looked down at the paper he shoved against my chest. It was a typed document demanding that I formally apologize to Diane and Brittany and legally pledge full ownership of my property to the family trust. He was weaponizing public shame, hoping the horrified stares of my colleagues and clients would pressure me into signing away my life savings. He jerked my arm again. "Everyone here needs to see how you treat your own blood," he yelled, addressing the crowded lobby. She threw her niece out into the cold. "She is a heartless corporate machine who cares more about real estate than flesh and blood." The lobby was dead silent. Several junior analysts from my team were standing near the elevator banks, their mouths hanging open. My department manager, a strict woman who valued discretion above all else, was watching from the security desk. My father was actively trying to destroy my professional reputation, the very foundation of the financial independence that allowed me to escape their control. He wanted me destitute so I would have to crawl back to them. I did not shrink away. I forcefully yanked my arm out of his grasp, smoothing down the sleeve of my blazer with deliberate precision. My voice was icy professional and loud enough for everyone to hear. "You do not get to come into my place of work and assault me," I said coldly. "You are not my family. You are a trespasser." I turned my back on my father entirely. I looked directly at the head of building security. "This man is estranged from me," I stated clearly, maintaining absolute professional composure. "He has no authorization to be on these premises. He just physically assaulted me. Please escort him out of the building immediately. If he resists, contact the Chicago police and press charges. I want his photograph placed at the front desk. He is permanently banned." Richard gasped, his face draining of color. The realization that his public shaming tactic had spectacularly backfired hit him like a physical blow. "You cannot do this to your own father. he stammered, his booming voice shrinking. The two security guards gave him no chance to say anything else. They grabbed him by the shoulders and forcefully marched him toward the revolving glass doors. "I am your father," he screamed, digging his heels into the marble floor. "You owe us." I walked straight over to my manager, who was standing by the reception desk. I kept my head high, projecting absolute confidence. I apologized for the disruption. I told her, my tone steady and completely businesslike. That was an estranged relative, attempting to extort me over a personal real estate asset. The situation has been handled, and building security has been fully briefed. My manager studied my face before giving a curt, respectful nod. "Handle it, Hailey," she said simply. "Do whatever you need to keep that chaos out of this firm." I thanked her and walked straight back to the elevators. The moment the metal doors closed, sealing me off from the prying eyes of the lobby, the icy professional facade cracked. I leaned heavily against the handrail, my knees shaking violently. The spot on my arm where my father grabbed me throbbed with a dull pain. The emotional toll of the confrontation crashed over me in suffocating waves. Even though I had handled the situation like a seasoned professional, the workplace humiliation stung deeply. I had worked so hard to build a spotless reputation in a highly competitive industry. Now my colleagues had witnessed my father screaming like a lunatic, airing fabricated dirty laundry. The shame was a bitter metallic taste in my mouth. But beneath the shame, a terrifying realization began to take root. They were not going to stop. My family was escalating their tactics, from social media smear campaigns to physical ambushes at my place of employment. They were actively trying to destroy my livelihood. If they could not have my money, they wanted to make sure I could not have it either. They wanted to break me down, isolate me, and ruin my career until I surrendered the property out of sheer exhaustion. Setting boundaries was no longer enough. I needed to completely and permanently sever all ties. Returning to my Chicago apartment that evening, the silence offered little comfort. My mind was racing with contingency plans. I needed to make sure they had zero reason to ever contact me again. I marched into my spare bedroom and pulled a large shipping box out of the closet. When I forced them out of the lake house, they left in a chaotic hurry and left several items behind. Now I realized throwing them away would just give Jamal an excuse to sue me for destruction of personal property. I decided to box up everything Diane and Brittany left behind and mail it back via certified courier. I wanted a signed delivery receipt proving I returned their belongings, closing the very last loophole they could use to harass me. I grabbed Brittany's makeup bag and tossed it into the box. Next, I picked up Diane's heavy designer winter coat. My mother always flaunted that coat at family gatherings, bragging about how much it cost. I sneered at the memory, folding the wool fabric. As I pressed the coat down, I heard the distinct crinkle of paper coming from one of the deep-side pockets. As an auditor, my brain is hardwired to document and verify everything. I knew that if I mailed the coat back and there was cash in the pocket, Diane would absolutely lie and claim I had stolen thousands of dollars from her. I needed to empty the pockets completely and document the contents before sealing the box. I reached my hand into the right pocket and pulled out a crumpled, stiff piece of paper. It was stained with a dark brown ring, like someone had carelessly set a coffee mug on top of it before shoving it away. I smoothed the crumpled paper out on my kitchen island, expecting it to be a dry cleaning receipt. Instead, I found myself staring at a formal banking document. I adjusted the lighting and leaned over the island, my eyes scanning the creased paper. The logo at the top belonged to a major national bank. As my eyes tracked down the columns of numbers, the breath hitched in my throat. It was a formal notice of a missed payment. It was not for a credit card or a car loan. It was a default warning for a second mortgage on my parents' primary residence in Chicago. I stared at the numbers, my mind struggling to process the impossible information right in front of me. The document clearly stated the account was severely past due, and the bank was preparing to initiate foreclosure proceedings if the massive balance was not paid immediately. This made absolutely zero sense. My parents paid off their Chicago home entirely over 10 years ago. They threw a massive party to celebrate burning their mortgage papers. Diane constantly bragged about living debt-free. They were supposed to be financially secure. Why would they take out an incredibly risky second mortgage on a house they already owned outright? And more importantly, why were they defaulting on it so badly that the bank was threatening immediate foreclosure? The gears in my analytical brain began to spin at a dizzying speed. I looked at the date on the receipt. The second mortgage had been taken out exactly 6 months ago. The principal loan amount was staggering, a massive sum of cash that had been borrowed and instantly drained. I read the warning notice again, the pieces of a dark puzzle falling into place. Diane and Richard were not just greedy, they were completely broke. They were drowning in a massive ocean of debt, teetering on the absolute edge of losing the roof over their heads. The realization hit me like a freight train. The ambush at my housewarming party, the coordinated digital smear campaign, the unhinged physical attack at my office today. They did not want my lake house for free summer vacations. They needed my house because they were entirely bankrupt. They wanted to transfer my $1 million property into a family trust so they could leverage it for another loan to save themselves from financial ruin. I stared at the crumpled receipt, a sharp clarity washing over me. They were willing to sacrifice my entire future to cover up their catastrophic financial failure. But the biggest, most terrifying question remained. Where did all that missing money go? I pulled my heavy laptop out of my work bag and opened it on the kitchen counter. I was a highly trained corporate financial auditor, and I was about to do what I do best. I was going to follow the trail of their stolen money. I sat at my kitchen counter, the stark white glow of my laptop screen illuminating the dark apartment. My fingers hovered over the keyboard as the absurdity of the situation washed over me. The pieces simply did not fit together. For my entire adult life, my mother had cultivated an image of absolute financial superiority. Diane constantly bragged to her friends about living entirely debt-free. She looked down on anyone who carried a mortgage balance past the age of 50. My father, Richard, was notoriously cheap, meticulously tracking every dollar he spent on my basic needs. Yet here I was staring at a default notice for a massive second mortgage on their primary Chicago residence. A home supposed to be fully paid off 10 years ago. It made absolutely zero sense. The contradiction became even more glaring when I thought about my sister and her husband. Brittany and Jamal flaunted a wealthy lifestyle. Jamal loved to play the part of the highly successful African-American entrepreneur dominating family dinners, with loud tales of his lucrative investments. Just last month, Brittany had paraded a new $10,000 designer handbag at a family brunch, while Jamal casually tossed the keys to a brand new luxury SUV on the table. They took lavish vacations, dined at Michelin-starred restaurants, and dressed Kinsley in custom boutique clothing. If Jamal was truly generating the kind of wealth he claimed, why would my parents need to take out a highly leveraged, incredibly risky loan against the only valuable asset they owned? The math was entirely wrong. In my line of work, when the math does not balance, it means someone is actively lying. I poured myself a black coffee, cracked my knuckles, and prepared to tear their financial facade apart to the studs. I was going to audit my own family. I started with the most concrete piece of evidence I had: the crumpled warning notice on my kitchen island. I logged into the Cook County Recorder of Deeds public portal, navigating the familiar database I use daily for corporate compliance checks. I typed in the index number for my parents' suburban Chicago home. The digital ledger populated, instantly displaying a 30-year history of property transactions. I scrolled past the original warranty deed and the triumphant release of mortgage recorded a decade ago. I kept scrolling until I hit the recent filings. My breath caught in my throat. There it was, recorded exactly 6 months ago. A brand new mortgage lien placed on the property. The loan amount was a staggering $800,000. But the lender was not a traditional national bank or a reputable credit union. It was a private equity lending group known in the financial industry for predatory interest rates and aggressive foreclosure tactics. These were the lenders of absolute last resort. You only went to them when traditional banks rejected your applications because your credit was entirely destroyed or your debt-to-income ratio was catastrophic. The terms of the loan were publicly attached to the filing, and they were financial suicide. The interest rate was exorbitant, and it included a balloon payment clause that guaranteed imminent default if the borrowers did not have massive liquid cash flow. My parents had effectively signed away the roof over their heads under the most desperate punishing terms imaginable. It was a sheer act of financial desperation. They had leveraged $800,000 in cash. But where did it go? They had not done home renovations. They had not purchased new vehicles. They had not taken any luxury trips. The massive injection of cash had simply vanished into thin air. When an auditor finds a massive unexplained cash withdrawal, the next step is to look for the nearest financial black hole. In my family, that black hole was clearly Jamal. I opened a new browser tab and navigated to the Illinois Secretary of State Business Entity Search portal. Jamal referred to himself as a venture capitalist and the managing director of an elite private equity firm. I typed his full legal name into the registered agent database and hit search. The results populated, and a cold, grim smile spread across my face. Jamal did not own an elite private equity firm. He owned a tangled, chaotic web of limited liability companies, each one with a more ridiculous, grandiose name than the last. I started clicking through the corporate filings, downloading the annual reports and organizational charts. The facade of his sprawling business empire began to crumble instantly. The prestigious downtown corporate headquarters he always bragged about did not exist. I cross-referenced the business addresses listed on the state filings. They were not high-rise office suites. They were virtual mail drops, located in strip malls, shared co-working spaces, and one address that literally mapped to a UPS store next to a dry cleaner. He was running a ghost operation. I dug into the financial disclosures of his primary holding company. The entity had no registered employees, no substantial tangible assets, and no verified revenue streams. It was a classic shell company structure designed to project an illusion of corporate legitimacy while actually functioning as a hollow vessel for moving money around. My arrogant, flashy brother-in-law was nothing but a paper tiger. But being a fake entrepreneur did not explain where $800,000 of my parents' money had gone. I needed to find the specific legal or financial catalyst that forced them to take out that predatory loan. I shifted my focus from his corporate structure to his regulatory compliance. If Jamal was running shell companies, he was likely cutting corners elsewhere. I accessed the State Department of Revenue database to check the good standing status of his various entities. My screen lit up with red flags. Almost every single company tied to his name was listed as not in good standing. I pulled the specific disciplinary actions. His primary business license had been officially suspended 3 months ago by the state board. The reason was clearly listed in the public file: failure to pay state and federal corporate taxes for 3 consecutive years. He had multiple tax liens filed against him by the Internal Revenue Service, totaling tens of thousands of dollars. The man wearing a $50,000 watch at my dinner table was actively dodging the federal government for unpaid taxes. The illusion of his wealth was entirely funded by debt and tax evasion. But tax liens alone would not require an immediate $800,000 cash injection from my parents. There had to be an active, aggressive threat, something that required immediate liquid capital to prevent total destruction. I opened the federal civil court docket system known as PACER and ran a comprehensive nationwide search on Jamal. The system took a few seconds to load, and then the final, devastating piece of the puzzle materialized on my screen. It was a massive civil lawsuit filed in federal court exactly 7 months ago, just 1 month before my parents took out their desperate second mortgage. The plaintiffs were a group of 20 independent investors. The charges were severe: fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, and gross financial negligence. I downloaded the 80-page legal complaint and began reading the allegations. Jamal had operated an aggressive cryptocurrency investment scheme. He solicited millions from private investors, promising them guaranteed astronomical returns. Instead of investing, he used their money to finance his lavish lifestyle. He bought luxury cars, designer clothes, and expensive vacations using his clients' capital. It was a textbook Ponzi scheme that spectacularly collapsed when the cryptocurrency market dipped and investors demanded their money back. He lost everything, leaving him legally liable for hundreds of thousands of dollars in stolen funds. The plaintiffs moved to freeze his personal assets and threatened to refer the case to federal authorities for criminal wire fraud prosecution. If Jamal did not produce massive settlement money immediately, he was going to federal prison. The timeline was undeniably clear. 7 months ago, the lawsuit was filed and Jamal panicked. He went to my parents spinning lies about a temporary cash flow problem. Diane and Richard, desperate to protect their golden child's perfect marriage, quietly mortgaged their fully paid-off home to save him. They handed Jamal $800,000 in cash. But Jamal's debts were a bottomless pit. He burned through their money, failed to settle the lawsuits, and left my parents holding a predatory mortgage they could never repay. Now they were facing imminent foreclosure. That was the sinister, terrifying truth behind the housewarming ambush. They did not want my lake house for family vacations. They wanted to force me to sign a quitclaim deed to a family trust controlled by Jamal. They planned to leverage my million-dollar debt-free property to secure another loan to bail themselves out of catastrophic ruin. I sat frozen at my kitchen island, staring at the screen as the horrific reality of my family's betrayal washed over me. The sheer scale of their deception was breathtaking. I did not move for hours, letting the glow of the monitor burn the details of Jamal's impending federal indictment into my brain. The weekend slipped away as I descended further into the digital breadcrumbs, transforming my dining table into a forensic auditing war room. I cross-referenced the civil court dockets with federal regulatory filings, and the picture grew exponentially darker. Jamal was not just facing angry private investors. He had caught the attention of the Securities and Exchange Commission. I uncovered a pending SEC enforcement action buried in the federal database. His assets were entirely frozen. His bank accounts were locked down by court order, and his passport had likely been flagged. He was drowning in a catastrophic ocean of legal fees and restitution demands, with the very real threat of a federal prison sentence hanging over his head. The cryptocurrency scheme he had orchestrated was a spectacular, reckless failure built entirely on false promises and stolen capital. The real motive behind my parents' sudden desperation slammed into me with sickening clarity. Diane and Richard had not just made a poor financial decision. They had knowingly and willingly sacrificed their own financial security to protect a criminal. My mother was obsessed with our family's public image. The thought of her precious daughter's husband being hauled away in handcuffs, his fraud exposed to their elite social circle, was a fate worse than death to her. To prevent that public humiliation, she had convinced my father to mortgage their fully paid-off home. They handed Jamal $800,000 in clean, untraceable cash to quiet the loudest investors and stall the federal criminal investigation. But it was not enough. Ponzi schemes are bottomless pits, and Jamal's debts far exceeded the equity in my parents' home. He had burned through their bailout money in a matter of months, leaving them holding a predatory loan they could never repay. With the bank threatening foreclosure on their primary residence, and Jamal still facing federal prosecution, they were cornered beasts. They needed another massive influx of liquid capital, and they needed it immediately. That was when they set their sights on me. I was the perfect unsuspecting target. I was a single woman with a highly successful career and a brand new million-dollar lake house. In their twisted, self-serving logic, my hard-earned property was not a home. It was an unexploited asset. They orchestrated the housewarming ambush not to secure a vacation spot but to execute a hostile financial takeover. They wanted to force me to transfer my deed into a family trust so Jamal could legally leverage my house for another predatory loan. They were fully prepared to let me pay the mortgage while they drained the equity to keep him out of prison. They were willing to destroy my entire future, ruin my credit, and steal the single greatest achievement of my professional life, all to maintain a fragile social lie. The profound cruelty of it took my breath away. They did not view me as a daughter. They viewed me as collateral. I closed my laptop and pushed away from the island, a cold, sharp armor forming around my heart. I had spent my entire life trying to earn their respect, believing that if I just worked hard enough and achieved enough, they would finally see my value. Instead, they only saw a piggy bank to smash open when their golden child's husband ran out of stolen money. I walked over to the window and looked out at the Chicago skyline, formulating my next move. I had the evidence, I had the paper trail. Now I needed to figure out how to completely neutralize them before they tried another desperate attack. As I stood there calculating my legal options, my cell phone vibrated on the counter. I walked over and looked at the screen. It was Diane. My first instinct was to reject the call immediately. I had blocked her across all social media platforms, but I had left her phone number unblocked for emergency legal purposes. I stared at the incoming call knowing that answering it was a risk. But my training as an auditor kicked in. You do not turn away from incoming data when you are building a fraud case. You collect it. I took a deep breath, cleared my throat, and pressed accept. Hello, I said, keeping my voice entirely flat and devoid of emotion. Hailey, oh, thank God you picked up, Diane's voice came through the speaker, and it was entirely unrecognizable. Gone was the shrill, demanding tone she had used to threaten me in my living room. Gone was the arrogant condescension she had used to belittle my career. Instead, her voice was soft, trembling, and choked with heavy, dramatic tears. I remained silent, letting her play her hand. Sweetheart, please do not hang up, she pleaded, a manufactured sob breaking her sentence. I have been crying for days. Your father and I are just absolutely heartbroken over how things ended at the lake house. We were so wrong, Hailey. I was so wrong. We let our pride get in the way, and I have just been sick with guilt ever since. I raised an eyebrow at the empty apartment. The sheer audacity of her performance was staggering. She was weeping into the phone, playing the role of the devastated, remorseful mother to absolute perfection. If I had not spent the entire weekend uncovering her catastrophic financial ruin, I might have actually believed her. I might have felt a familiar pang of guilt and rushed to comfort her. But armed with the knowledge of her impending foreclosure and her daughter's husband's federal criminal fraud investigation, her tears sounded like cheap theater. I have spent the last few weeks doing a lot of soul-searching. Diane continued, her voice dripping with artificial affection. Family is more important than pride, Hailey. Family is everything. We miss you so much. Brittany misses you. We realize we pushed you too hard, and we want to make things right. We cannot bear this distance anymore. Please, sweetie, let us heal this rift. She paused, waiting for me to jump in with forgiveness, waiting for me to crave her sudden, uncharacteristic warmth. I gave her nothing but silence. I wanted to see how desperate she was. Hailey, are you still there? She asked, a tiny sliver of panic leaking through her sweet facade. I am here, I replied calmly. We want to formally apologize, she said quickly, sensing my emotional detachment. We want to take you out to dinner. Just the family. A proper reconciliation dinner at that high-end Chicago steakhouse downtown, the one you always loved. We want to treat you, look you in the eye, and beg for your forgiveness. Please just give us one evening to show you how much we love you. The trap was so glaringly obvious it almost made me laugh. Diane never apologized for anything in her life. She certainly did not offer to pay for expensive steakhouse dinners just to admit she was wrong. They were terrified. The initial ambush had failed. The social media smear campaign had not broken me. The public attack at my office had ended in humiliation. They were out of options, out of time, and out of money. This reconciliation dinner was a desperate, calculated snare. They wanted to get me into a highly public, upscale environment where they could use social pressure and emotional manipulation to trap me. They probably planned to ambush me with legal documents right at the dinner table, banking on the fact that I would avoid causing a scene in a high-end restaurant. They thought they could guilt me into signing away my lake house over a glass of expensive wine and a fake apology. They thought I was still the obedient, desperate daughter who would trade everything for a scrap of maternal affection. They had no idea that they were inviting a forensic auditor who had already dissected their entire financial existence. They were walking into a battlefield completely blind, believing they held all the weapons. I looked at the crumpled bank receipt still sitting on my kitchen counter. I thought about the hours of they had put me through, the threats, the public shaming, the sheer willingness to ruin my life to save a fraudster. They wanted a dinner. I was going to give them a feast. I let a few seconds of silence stretch over the phone line, allowing Diane to sweat. I smoothed my hand over the cold quartz countertop and let a slow, icy smile spread across my face. I would love to, Mom, I said, injecting just enough warmth into my voice to make the lie believable. Let us heal this family. Oh, wonderful. Diane gasped, her relief so profound it practically vibrated through the speaker. Thank you, sweetie. I promise you will not regret this. We will see you on Friday at 7. I ended the call and tossed the phone onto the counter. The adrenaline coursed through my veins. I had 5 days to prepare for the ultimate confrontation. 5 days to build an airtight financial fortress around my assets. They wanted to play a high-stakes game, but they had severely underestimated their opponent. I was finally ready to expose their lies, and I would finally win. I needed airtight legal protection executed immediately. I sat across the heavy mahogany desk from my real estate attorney, a sharp, no-nonsense professional. I laid out the entire situation without an ounce of emotion. I told him about the housewarming ambush, the coordinated digital harassment, my father causing a scene in my corporate lobby, and the massive financial fraud I had uncovered. I explained that my family was facing total financial ruin, and my mother had just lured me into a fake reconciliation dinner on Friday night. I knew with absolute certainty they were going to corner me in that upscale restaurant and try to force me into signing a quitclaim deed. My attorney listened to the entire story with wide eyes, completely appalled by the sheer audacity of their plan. When I finished speaking, he folded his hands on his desk and assured me that we were going to build an impenetrable fortress around my assets. We immediately began the legal maneuvering. I instructed him to create an anonymous limited liability company registered in Delaware, a state known for its strict corporate privacy shields. As the sole managing member of this new company, I would retain absolute control over everything, but my personal name would no longer appear on the public property records. Once the corporate entity was rapidly established, we executed a warranty deed transferring the title of my Lake Geneva home directly from me as an individual into the newly formed holding company. I willingly paid the expedited filing fees, not caring about the extra expense. The legal brilliance of this maneuver was beautifully simple. By transferring the property to a corporate entity, I was entirely removing myself as the personal owner of the asset. My attorney ensured the transfer was absolutely bulletproof, filing the new deed with the county recorder electronically that very afternoon. He smiled as he handed me the final confirmation receipt. He explained that even if my family somehow managed to physically corner me at the restaurant, and even if they used extreme emotional manipulation or coercion to force me to sign a personal quitclaim deed, that piece of paper would be completely null and void. You cannot legally transfer an asset you do not individually own. If I signed a personal deed handing the house over to Jamal on Friday night, it would hold the exact same legal weight as if I had signed over the Brooklyn Bridge. It was a worthless piece of paper. Walking out of the law firm that afternoon, the heavy weight of anxiety that had been crushing my chest for weeks completely evaporated. I was untouchable. They could scream, they could cry, they could threaten me with estrangement, but they could not touch my sanctuary. The lake house was safe, locked behind a corporate veil that their desperate, grasping hands could never pierce. I spent the next 3 days at my auditing job operating with laser focus. Every time my mother sent a sickeningly sweet text message about how excited she was for our special family dinner, I just smiled and gave a polite, brief reply. She thought she was reeling in a naive, desperate daughter. She had no idea she was communicating with a woman who had already dismantled their entire trap. By Thursday evening, the legal shield was fully in place, but I needed an offensive strategy. A shield protects you, but a sword ends the battle. I left my corporate office and walked 3 blocks down the street to a high-end professional printing shop. I rented a private computer terminal and pulled up the encrypted flash drive I had loaded with all my forensic research. I was going to beat them using the one language I spoke better than anyone else: concrete, undeniable data. I spent 2 hours carefully assembling the documents. I printed the 80-page federal lawsuit detailing Jamal and his collapsed cryptocurrency investment scheme. I highlighted the specific paragraphs where the plaintiffs accused him of wire fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, and gross financial negligence. I printed the official state records showing his suspended business licenses and his massive unpaid federal tax liens. I deliberately printed the pages showing his outstanding tax balances in bright, glaring red ink to emphasize the sheer magnitude of his financial delinquency. I wanted it to be impossible for my sister to look away from the ugly reality of her husband and his deceit. Finally, I printed the most devastating piece of evidence of all, the recorded notice of default and the impending foreclosure warning on my parents' primary Chicago residence. The paper trail proving they had mortgaged their entire future to bail out a criminal. I did not just staple these papers together. I wanted the presentation to carry the psychological weight of a corporate audit. I purchased 4 sleek, heavy black presentation folders. I placed the documents inside each folder in a specific chronological order, creating a devastating narrative of their financial ruin. I added a custom printed cover page to each dossier. I made one for Jamal, one for my sister Brittany, one for my father Richard, and one for my mother Diane. I wanted them to hold their spectacular failure in their own hands. I wanted the physical weight of their lies to sit right on the table in front of them. As I paid the cashier at the printing shop and slid the 4 heavy dossiers into my leather briefcase, a profound sense of anticipation washed over me. For 31 years, I had allowed these people to dictate my worth. I had let them convince me that I was inherently flawed because I preferred building a solid career over chasing superficial social status. They had mocked my dedication, sneered at my independence, and tried to steal the very reward of my hard work. But the evidence sitting inside my briefcase proved that their entire reality was a pathetic, crumbling illusion. Friday finally arrived, the day of the so-called reconciliation dinner. I left my office early and went straight back to my apartment to prepare. This was not just a family dinner. This was the final battle, and I was dressing for war. I stood in front of my closet, pushing past the soft sweaters and casual dresses I normally wore around them to make myself look smaller and less intimidating. I was done shrinking. I reached for my most expensive, custom-tailored corporate suit. It was a sharp, immaculate charcoal gray two-piece that I reserved exclusively for presenting major audit findings to hostile corporate boards. The cut of the blazer demanded respect, and the structured lines projected absolute, unwavering authority. I paired it with a crisp white silk blouse and fastened a sleek silver watch around my wrist. Every single item I wore was a testament to the life I had built entirely independent of their toxic influence. I was wrapping myself in the physical proof of my hard-earned success. I took my time getting ready, applying my makeup with crisp, flawless precision. I pulled my hair back into a sleek, tight twist that left my face completely open and unbothered. I slipped on a pair of pointed black heels that clicked with sharp authority against the hardwood floor of my apartment. I looked at my reflection in the full-length mirror. The woman staring back at me was a stranger to the family I was about to face. She was not the bullied younger daughter who desperately craved her mother and her toxic affection. She was not the quiet sister who bit her tongue while being mocked. She was a senior financial auditor walking into a hostile boardroom to dismantle a failing enterprise. I checked my watch. It was 6:30 in the evening. I grabbed my leather briefcase, feeling the satisfying weight of the 4 black dossiers resting inside. The restaurant they had chosen was a notoriously expensive, highly exclusive steakhouse right in the heart of downtown Chicago. It was the kind of place where closing a deal meant ordering $1,000 bottles of wine and showing off for the rest of the dining room. It was exactly the kind of venue my mother would choose to maintain her wealthy facade, even as her real home was being snatched away by the bank. I knew exactly how she operated. She probably intended to put the entire extravagant meal on a credit card that was already dangerously close to its maximum limit, convinced that the setting alone would intimidate me into silent compliance. She assumed the dim lighting, the hovering waiters, and the clinking crystal glasses would trap me in my old habits of polite submission. I took a deep breath, letting the cool, calm logic of my profession settle over my racing heart. I had the legal protection. I had the financial evidence. I had the absolute truth on my side. I walked out of my apartment, locked the door, and headed toward the elevator. The trap was set, and they were already sitting right in the middle of it. It was time for the payoff. I stepped out of my cab and stood before the heavy mahogany doors of the city's most exclusive steakhouse. The crisp Chicago wind whipped around me, but I felt entirely impervious to the cold. My posture was perfectly straight, and my grip on my leather briefcase was unyielding. Inside that briefcase sat the 4 black dossiers containing the absolute destruction of my family's financial facade. I walked through this grand entrance, offering a polite nod to the host. When I gave him my mother's name, he immediately escorted me past the crowded main dining floor. We walked toward a secluded corridor lined with private dining rooms. These rooms were reserved for high-stakes corporate negotiations and elite social gatherings. The host opened a thick oak door, revealing my family sitting around a grand circular table beneath a sparkling crystal chandelier. Diane, Richard, Brittany, and Jamal all turned to look at me simultaneously. The visual impact of my arrival hit them exactly as I had intended. I was not wearing the soft, accommodating clothes they were used to seeing me in. I was wearing my most intimidating corporate armor. My dark gray suit signaled absolute authority, and my expression gave away absolutely nothing. For a brief second, a flash of genuine uncertainty crossed my mother's face. She had expected to see a broken, anxious daughter desperate for her approval. Instead, she was looking at a senior financial auditor, ready to dismantle a hostile takeover. But Diane was a master of maintaining appearances. She quickly masked her hesitation with a wide, artificial smile. "Hailey, sweetheart," Diane cooed, standing up and rushing over to pull me into a tight, suffocating embrace. "I am so incredibly happy you came tonight. We have missed you so much." I allowed the hug, keeping my arms relaxed and my face impassive. I took my designated seat across from Jamal. My African-American brother-in-law was leaning back in his chair with a posture of extreme arrogance. He wore a custom-tailored navy suit and a flashy gold watch that I now knew was purchased with stolen investment funds. He flashed me a brilliant, completely fake smile. "Hailey, it is great to see you," Jamal said, projecting the booming voice of a wildly successful entrepreneur. "We wanted to treat you to the absolute best tonight. Only the finest for family." He snapped his fingers to summon the sommelier. Jamal loudly ordered 2 bottles of the most expensive vintage red wine on the menu, making sure to emphasize the price tag so everyone in the room could hear. I watched him perform this pathetic charade with a mixture of disgust and dark amusement. He was staring down the barrel of a massive federal fraud investigation. His business licenses were suspended and his bank accounts were frozen. Yet here he was, racking up a massive bill on a credit card that was undoubtedly teetering on the edge of its limit. He was desperately trying to project wealth to intimidate me, hoping the lavish setting would make me feel small and compliant. I simply placed my napkin on my lap and offered a cool, polite smile. "Thank you for hosting, Jamal," I said evenly. "I am very much looking forward to this evening." The waiters brought out towering plates of expensive appetizers, oysters, thick cuts of bacon, and massive shrimp cocktails. My father, Richard, picked at his food nervously. He refused to make direct eye contact with me, keeping his gaze fixed on his plate. I knew he was terrified. He was the one who had caused a massive public scene in my corporate lobby just days ago. Now he was sitting across from me, suffocating under the weight of his own guilt and the impending foreclosure of his home. As the main courses were cleared away, the mood in the private dining room shifted. The superficial chatter died down, and Diane gently tapped her wineglass with a silver spoon. She stood up slowly, pressing her hand against her chest in a gesture of profound emotional vulnerability. "Hailey," Diane began, her voice quivering with perfectly calibrated sorrow. "I asked us all to gather here tonight because I need to make things right. The last few weeks have been a nightmare for me. I have not slept. I have barely eaten. I have just been consumed by the thought of my beautiful family being torn apart." She let a single dramatic tear fall down her cheek. She wiped it away with a cloth napkin, ensuring everyone witnessed her pain. "We let our pride get the better of us at your housewarming party." Diane continued, her voice thick with fake remorse. "We pushed you too hard, and we forgot to tell you how incredibly proud we are of your success. You bought that beautiful house all on your own, and we should have celebrated you. Instead, we made you feel cornered. I am so deeply sorry, my sweet girl." family needs to stick together through thick and thin. We need to protect each other at all costs. Diane sat back down, reaching across the table to grab my father's hand. Brittany immediately picked up the performance. My older sister leaned forward, her eyes wide and pleading. Hailey, Mom is right, Brittany said, her voice dripping with manufactured sweetness. I acted terribly that night. I was just so overwhelmed by how beautiful your property was, and I got carried away thinking about Kinsley having a place to spend her summers. I completely forgot my boundaries, and I sincerely apologize for causing that unfortunate misunderstanding. I love you, and I hate that we have been fighting. Please say you can forgive us and move forward. The execution of their emotional manipulation was entirely flawless. If I had not spent my entire weekend auditing their catastrophic financial ruin, this highly coordinated apology might have actually worked. I might have believed their tears. I might have felt a desperate surge of hope that my family finally loved and respected me. But knowing the dark, desperate truth behind their performance completely insulated me from their trap. They were not apologizing because they loved me. They were apologizing because they needed to steal my house to save Jamal from federal prison. I kept my expression perfectly neutral, letting a small, gentle smile touch my lips. I appreciate you saying that, Brittany, I replied, keeping my voice soft and agreeable. I appreciate all of you taking the time to apologize. Family is complicated, but healing is always possible. A collective sigh of relief washed over the table. Diane beamed, her shoulders relaxing visibly. Jamal smirked, clearly believing their emotional ambush had successfully softened my defenses. They thought they had me exactly where they wanted me. Compliant, forgiving, and desperate to belong. Right before the waiters returned to offer the dessert menu, the atmosphere in the room crystallized into sharp focus. Jamal cleared his throat and smoothly reached down to his expensive leather briefcase resting on the floor. He pulled out a thick stack of legal documents printed on heavy premium paper. He placed the stack right in the center of the table and slid it carefully across the white tablecloth until it rested directly in front of me. I looked down at the top page, maintaining my calm, steady breathing. Hailey, Jamal said, his voice dropping into a smooth, reassuring tone. Since we are all here focusing on healing and protecting our family, we wanted to present you with a solution that benefits everyone. This is a standard family trust agreement. Your parents and Brittany and I have all agreed to consolidate our resources to ensure our family legacy is protected for generations to come. We want to include your new lake property in this trust. He handed me a heavy gold pen, gesturing to the signature line at the bottom of the document. We are going to handle all the legal fees, the maintenance costs, and the property taxes. Jamal continued smoothly. You will never have to worry about a single financial burden regarding that house ever again. It is a completely standard procedure for wealthy families like ours to shield our assets. Just sign right there at the bottom, and we can finally put all of this ugly drama behind us. I looked down at the document. It was exactly what I had anticipated. Buried beneath the dense, confusing legal jargon was a standard quitclaim deed. If I signed that paper, I would be legally transferring the entire title of my $1 million home directly to Jamal and Brittany. They were attempting to execute their hostile takeover right before my eyes, masked as an act of familial unity. The entire family stared at me, holding their collective breath, waiting for me to submit. I picked up the gold pen, feeling its cold metal against my fingers, and looked up at the four faces watching me with pure, desperate, greedy anticipation. I held the heavy gold pen suspended above the thick stack of legal documents. The air in the private dining room grew so thick and stagnant that it felt difficult to breathe. I looked directly into my mother's eyes. Diane leaned forward over the pristine white tablecloth. Her hands were clasped tightly under her chin in a posture of artificial prayer. Sign it, sweetie, Diane urged softly. Her voice was a perfectly calibrated mixture of maternal warmth and subtle pressure. Just sign the paper and show us you are truly part of this family. Show us that you understand what family legacy actually means. I shifted my gaze to Jamal. My brother-in-law was practically vibrating with nervous energy disguised as casual arrogance. He offered me a condescending smirk, adjusting the cuffs of his tailored navy suit. He was so incredibly confident that his grand manipulation was working flawlessly. I truly believed he had broken me down using nothing but a fancy steakhouse and a few fake tears. I let my shoulders slump forward just a fraction of an inch. I let out a long, shaky breath, carefully constructing the exact image of a defeated, exhausted daughter who was finally surrendering to the overwhelming pressure of her toxic family. I dropped my gaze back to the signature line at the bottom of the quitclaim deed. The document was designed to strip away my entire financial future and hand it directly to a criminal. I pressed the tip of Jamal's expensive gold pen against the thick paper. I did not hesitate. I signed my full legal name with a grand, sweeping flourish. The ink flowed smoothly across the page, binding the trap they thought they had built for me. I capped the pen and set it down next to my empty wine glass. The transformation in the room was absolute and instantaneous. The heavy, suffocating tension snapped like a dry twig. The moment the pen left the paper, the carefully constructed facade of familial love and reconciliation completely evaporated. Jamal did not even wait for the ink to dry. He lunged across the table and snatched the document out from under my hands with a sharp, triumphant bark of laughter. He quickly flipped through the pages to verify my signature, his eyes glowing with unrestrained greed. He shoved the paperwork back into his leather briefcase and snapped the brass locks shut with a loud, echoing click. Brittany leaned back in her chair and crossed her arms over her chest. A nasty, triumphant smirk twisted her features. "Well," Brittany said, her voice entirely stripped of the fake sisterly affection she had been projecting all evening. "Finally, you actually did something useful for someone other than yourself." I watched my mother drop her performance with breathtaking speed. The weeping, remorseful woman who had begged for my forgiveness just 10 minutes ago vanished into thin air. Diane sat up straight, her posture rigid and commanding once again. Her expression turned ice-cold and strictly businesslike. She looked at me not as a daughter she had just reconciled with, but as an annoying subordinate she had successfully disciplined. "We will be coming by the lake house this weekend to collect the spare keys," Diane stated flatly, leaving no room for discussion. "Make sure you clear out the master bedroom before Saturday morning. Brittany and Jamal are going to need that space for their summer plans. And leave the security system access codes on the kitchen counter." I sat perfectly still in my chair. I watched them celebrate their perceived victory. My father Richard let out a massive sigh of relief and flagged down a passing waiter to order another round of expensive drinks. They were practically giddy with relief. They genuinely thought they had just secured an $800,000 lifeline to bail themselves out of catastrophic financial ruin. They thought they had successfully robbed me blind while making me pay for the privilege of sitting at their table. I reached for my crystal wine glass. The deep red liquid caught the light from the chandelier overhead. I took a slow, deliberate sip, letting the rich flavor settle on my tongue. I set the glass down gently. I folded my hands neatly on my lap and looked directly across the table at my brother-in-law. The noise of their celebration faded into the background as my voice cut through the air, crisp and clear. "You can have the house, Jamal," I said evenly. My tone was devoid of any anger or sorrow. It was the calm, analytical voice of a corporate auditor stating an objective fact. Jamal paused mid-laugh, his brow furrowing in confusion at my complete lack of distress. He looked at me, a brief flicker of uncertainty crossing his arrogant features. "What are you talking about?" Jamal asked dismissively. "I already have the house. You just signed the family trust agreement. We are done here." I offered him a small razor-sharp smile. "You can absolutely have the house," I repeated, maintaining absolute eye contact. "If you can figure out who owns it." The entire table went dead silent. The waiter, who had been approaching with a fresh bottle of wine, seemed to sense the sudden drop in temperature and quickly pivoted away. Diane glared at me, her eyes narrowing suspiciously. "What kind of stupid game are you playing now?" Hailey, Diane snapped. "Stop being dramatic. We have the signed paperwork. You gave us the property." I leaned forward slightly, resting my elbows on the white tablecloth. "I did not give you anything," I stated clearly, letting each word land with devastating precision. "That document you just shoved into your briefcase is entirely worthless. It holds the exact same legal weight as a napkin." Jamal let out a harsh, nervous chuckle. You are bluffing, he said, though his hand subconsciously reached down to touch his leather briefcase. I watched you sign the quitclaim deed with my own two eyes. It is legally binding. I shook my head slowly, savoring the moment. A quitclaim deed is only legally binding if the person signing it actually owns the asset they are attempting to transfer. I explained, speaking to him like a slow child. You see, Jamal, you cannot transfer a property title that does not belong to you, and I am no longer the individual owner of the lake house in Wisconsin. The color began to drain from Jamal's face. His arrogant posture crumbled as the horrifying reality of my words began to penetrate his thick skull. Brittany looked back and forth between her husband and me, profound confusion twisting her features. What does she mean? Brittany demanded, her voice shrill and panicked. Jamal, what is she talking about? I kept my focus locked entirely on Jamal. 3 days ago, I contacted my real estate attorney, I said calmly, watching the sheer terror bloom in his eyes. I officially transferred the title and the deed of the property from my personal name into a private, anonymous, limited liability company registered in the state of Delaware. I am the sole managing member of that corporate entity, but Hailey, the individual, no longer owns any real estate in the state of Wisconsin. Jamal stared at me, his mouth opening and closing without any sound coming out. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. You just manipulated me into signing a personal quitclaim deed for an asset I do not legally own. I continued, my voice steady and unyielding. You might as well have asked me to sign over the Willis Tower. That piece of paper in your briefcase is completely null and void. The bank will laugh in your face if you try to file it. The trap you thought you set for me was empty before you even arrived tonight. You get absolutely nothing. The silence in the private dining room was absolute and terrifying. My family sat frozen like statues, completely unable to comprehend the sheer magnitude of their failure. The master plan they had desperately concocted to save themselves from total financial ruin had just evaporated into thin air. Jamal looked physically ill. The swagger and the bravado he had walked in with were entirely gone. He was staring at a future behind bars, and he knew it. My mother Diane was gripping the edge of the table so hard her knuckles were completely white. Her chest heaved as she struggled to pull oxygen into her lungs. The perfect, highly orchestrated ambush had been spectacularly dismantled, leaving them with absolutely nothing but the crushing reality of their impending doom. I sat back in my chair, feeling a profound sense of absolute power. I had not just survived their attack, I had completely neutralized it. But I was not finished yet. I reached down and picked up my leather briefcase from the floor. The real reckoning was just beginning. I placed the heavy leather briefcase directly onto the pristine white tablecloth, pushing aside my empty wine glass. The dull thud of the leather hitting the wood beneath the linen echoed in the silent room. Jamal stared at the briefcase like it was a live explosive. Diane opened her mouth, her face flushing with a desperate, frantic need to regain control of the narrative. She started to stammer out a frantic excuse, something about how I was misunderstanding their generous intentions, but I cut her off instantly. I raised my hand, holding my palm up in a sharp, universal gesture for absolute silence. I told her to close her mouth and listen, because the emotional manipulation portion of the evening was officially over. I unclasped the brass locks on my briefcase. The sharp metallic clicks sounded like gunshots in the quiet private dining room. I reached inside and pulled out the 4 thick custom-printed black dossiers I had meticulously assembled. They were heavy, filled with dozens of pages of undeniable verified financial doom. I did not throw them. I did not yell. I moved with the cold, calculated precision of a senior forensic auditor who was about to dismantle a fraudulent corporation piece by piece. I slid the first black dossier across the table. It stopped perfectly in front of Jamal. I slid the second one to my sister Brittany. The third went to my father Richard, and the final dossier stopped right in front of Diane. I instructed them to open the folders. I told them that since they wanted to hold a formal family meeting about consolidating our assets and protecting our wealth, we were going to conduct a comprehensive audit of exactly what they brought to the table. Jamal did not touch his folder. His hands were shaking slightly, resting on his lap beneath the table. He knew exactly what was inside. He knew the paper trail of his catastrophic failures had finally caught up to him. I did not wait for him to open it. I began reciting the data from memory, my voice projecting absolute, unwavering authority. I looked directly into his eyes and told the entire table that Jamal was not a venture capitalist. I announced that his primary business license had been officially suspended by the state 3 months ago for failing to pay his corporate taxes for 3 consecutive years. Brittany let out a sharp gasp, her eyes darting from me to her husband. She demanded to know what I was talking about, but Jamal refused to look at her. His jaw was clenched so tightly, a muscle twitched violently in his cheek. I did not stop. I told the room about the massive federal civil lawsuit filed against him 7 months ago by 20 different independent investors. I laid out the exact details of his collapsed cryptocurrency investment scheme. I explained how he had solicited millions of dollars from private clients, promising them guaranteed astronomical returns, only to illegally funnel their money into his own personal bank accounts to fund his lavish lifestyle. I looked at the expensive designer suit he was currently wearing and told him it was paid for with stolen capital. I revealed the pending enforcement action from the Securities and Exchange Commission, stating clearly that his personal and corporate assets were entirely frozen by federal court order. I watched his arrogant facade completely disintegrate as I announced that he was legally liable for hundreds of thousands of dollars in stolen funds, and that he was staring down the very real, very imminent threat of federal prison time for wire fraud. Brittany frantically ripped open the black dossier in front of her. Her perfectly manicured fingers trembled as she flipped through the heavy stack of legal complaints, court dockets, and tax liens. The color drained entirely from her face, leaving her looking sickly and hollow. She had spent the last 5 years acting superior to me, flaunting her luxury vehicles and custom boutique clothing, genuinely believing her husband was a financial genius. Now, the undeniable proof of his massive deception was staring her right in the face. She looked at the glaring red ink highlighting his unpaid federal tax balances. I turned my attention directly to my sister. I told her that her entire life was a pathetic, hollow illusion funded by debt and criminal evasion. I explained that her husband was drowning in an $800,000 financial black hole and that he had been actively lying to her every single day. She looked at Jamal, her eyes wide with absolute horror and betrayal. She begged him to tell her that these documents were fake, that I was just being a vindictive, jealous sister trying to ruin their happiness. Jamal remained completely silent, staring down at the white tablecloth, entirely unable to defend himself against the concrete, verified public records sitting in front of him. The silence was his absolute confession. Brittany let out a choked, devastated sob, pressing her hands against her mouth as the reality of her ruined life crashed over her. But I was not finished. The most devastating revelation was still waiting to be delivered. I turned my icy gaze away from the shattered couple and focused entirely on my parents. Diane and Richard were sitting shoulder to shoulder, looking like terrified prisoners awaiting their execution. My father was sweating profusely, a sheen of moisture glistening on his forehead under the crystal chandelier. My mother was clutching her cloth napkin so tightly, her knuckles were trembling in fear. I looked at Diane, the woman who had spent my entire life making me feel inadequate because I did not care about elite social status or projecting fake wealth. I told her to open the dossier. She refused, shaking her head side to side in a frantic, desperate denial. So I delivered the final blow verbally. I announced to the room that my parents were not the wealthy, debt-free retirees they pretended to be. I told Brittany that exactly 1 month after Jamal was hit with his federal fraud lawsuit, Diane and Richard had secretly taken out a massive, highly leveraged second mortgage on their primary residence in Chicago. The loan was for $800,000 in cash secured through a predatory private equity lending group. They had mortgaged the only valuable asset they owned to secretly bail out their criminal son-in-law and protect the family image from public humiliation. Brittany gasped again, her head whipping around to stare at our parents in profound shock. She had no idea they had handed her husband nearly $1 million in cash behind her back. I kept my voice loud and commanding, refusing to let them interrupt me. I explained that the bailout money was not enough. Ponzi schemes are bottomless pits, and Jamal had burned through their entire cash injection in a matter of months. Failing to settle the lawsuits and leaving my parents holding a predatory loan they could never possibly repay. I pointed to the final document in the folder. I announced that exactly 6 months after taking out that desperate loan, Diane and Richard had severely defaulted on the payments. I revealed the formal notice of default and the impending foreclosure warning. The bank was actively preparing to seize their home. They were completely bankrupt, drowning in debt, and days away from being thrown out onto the street. I told them I knew the exact reason they had ambushed me at my housewarming party. They did not want my lake house for innocent summer vacations. They wanted to force me to transfer my deed to them so Jamal could legally leverage my $1 million debt-free property for another predatory loan. They were fully prepared to sacrifice my entire future, ruin my credit, and steal the greatest achievement of my professional life, all to maintain a fragile, pathetic social lie. The dining room descended into absolute, unmitigated chaos. The reality of the total financial devastation completely shattered whatever restraint my family had left. Brittany snapped entirely. She shot up from her chair with such violent force that it tipped backward and crashed loudly onto the hardwood floor. She lunged at Jamal, tears streaming down her face, screaming at the top of her lungs. She began slapping his chest and shoulders, demanding to know how he could lie to her, how he could destroy their daughter's future, how he could steal her parents' house. Jamal threw his hands up to protect his face, shrinking away from her furious blows, shouting for her to calm down and stop making a scene in the restaurant. But Brittany was completely hysterical, her screams echoing off the soundproof walls of the private dining room. My father, Richard, completely collapsed under the weight of his guilt and failure. He put his elbows on the table, buried his face in his large hands, and began weeping loudly. His shoulders shook with heavy, devastating sobs as the reality of his impending homelessness finally caught up to him. He had enabled this disaster, actively handing over his life savings to a fraudster, and now he had absolutely nothing left to his name. But it was Diane whose reaction was the most intense and terrifying. My mother realized in that exact moment that her perfect elite social image was completely, irrevocably destroyed forever. She was going to be exposed to all her wealthy friends as a broke, desperate woman whose family was involved in federal crimes. The overwhelming shame was far too much for her fragile, narcissistic ego to process. She went entirely hysterical. She stood up, her face twisted in a mask of pure agony and pure fury, screaming at the top of her lungs. She wailed about the unfairness of it all, her voice cracking as she watched her golden child physically attack her criminal son-in-law. The entire room was a symphony of destruction, bitter tears, and unrestrained rage. I remained perfectly still in my chair, calmly sipping my ice water, watching the brilliant, chaotic implosion of the very people who had deliberately tried to ruin me. Amidst this spectacular wreckage, my mother Diane finally snapped her attention back to me. Her perfect social mask was gone, replaced by the ugly, desperate face of a narcissist who had entirely lost control. She slammed her hands flat against the white tablecloth and glared at me with pure, unadulterated hatred. Her chest heaved and her eyes were wild with panic. "How can you just sit there and smile?" Diane shrieked, her voice cracking under the strain of her fury. "Look at what you have done to us. Look at your sister. Look at your father. You planned this. You deliberately came here to destroy this family." I set my water glass down on the table with a soft, deliberate clink. I did not raise my voice, but my tone was cold enough to freeze the air between us. "I did not destroy anything, Mom," I replied evenly. "I simply turned on the lights. You are the ones who built a house of cards. I just showed you the match Jamal used to burn it down." Diane shook her head frantically, refusing to accept even a fraction of accountability. She pointed a trembling finger directly at my face. Her desperation made her completely delusional. "If you had just signed the house over, we could have fixed everything," Diane screamed, her voice echoing off the high ceiling. "We could have secured a loan. We could have paid the investors. We could have saved your father's home. You have all that equity just sitting there doing nothing. You are a selfish, heartless monster. You could have saved us, but you chose to be greedy." I looked at the woman who had spent my entire life making me feel small, inadequate, and utterly disposable. I looked at the mother who had willingly mortgaged her own future and then tried to steal mine just to maintain the illusion of elite wealth. I felt absolutely no sadness, no guilt, and no obligation. The final lingering thread of my familial loyalty completely dissolved, leaving behind a profound, impenetrable armor. I leaned forward, placing my hands flat on the table, and looked directly into my mother's terrified, angry eyes. I delivered the words clearly, making sure they etched themselves permanently into her memory. "You were willing to destroy my entire future just to maintain a lie," I said, my voice lethal and chillingly calm. "You wanted me to pay for the crimes of a fraudster so you could keep bragging to your friends at the country club. You do not care about me. You only care about the assets I can provide. You are not my family. You are liabilities." Diane gasped, her mouth opening and closing without a single sound coming out. The brutal, unvarnished truth of my statement completely robbed her of her ability to argue. I pushed my chair back and stood up, smoothing the front of my charcoal gray blazer. I was entirely finished. The audit was complete. The fraud was exposed, and my work here was done. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my sleek leather wallet. I moved with the exact calculated precision of a professional auditor wrapping up a hostile corporate meeting. I opened the wallet and pulled out two crisp $50 bills. I leaned over and placed the cash squarely in the center of the table, resting the bills precisely next to the useless quitclaim deed Jamal had tried to force me to sign. "That covers my single glass of wine, plus a generous tip for the waiter who had to tolerate your screaming," I announced to the room. I then turned my gaze to my brother-in-law. Jamal was staring at me from the corner, his face pale, his arrogant swagger completely annihilated. He looked like a cornered rat facing a massive federal trap. I offered him one final razor-sharp smile. "Enjoy paying the $600 dinner bill on your maxed-out credit cards, Jamal," I said, my voice dripping with absolute contempt. "I highly recommend you savor the steak. The food in federal prison is notoriously disappointing." Jamal swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously as the reality of his situation choked him. Brittany let out another devastated wail, burying her face in her hands. Richard continued to sob quietly into his napkin. Diane stood frozen, her eyes wide with shock and absolute defeat. They were entirely broken, consumed by the toxic, destructive mess they had created for themselves. I turned my back on them and walked toward the heavy oak door. I grasped the brass handle and pulled it open, stepping out of the private dining room and into the quiet, dimly lit corridor of the upscale steakhouse. I did not look back. Not once. I did not offer a final goodbye, and I did not hesitate. I simply walked away, leaving them screaming at each other in a frantic, inescapable cage of their own design. As I navigated the bustling main floor of the restaurant, a few patrons cast curious glances my way, having undoubtedly heard the muffled shouts leaking from the private room. I ignored them completely, maintaining my perfect professional posture. I walked through the grand entrance and stepped out into the crisp, biting wind of the Chicago night. The cold air hit my face and I took a massive, deep breath. The city felt entirely different tonight. It felt like it belonged to me. I hailed a passing taxi, gave the driver the address to my secure high-rise apartment, and slid into the back seat. As the cab merged into the glowing stream of downtown traffic, a profound, heavy silence settled over me. The drive back to my apartment was the quietest, most peaceful drive of my entire life. The suffocating anxiety that had plagued me for weeks, the constant, nagging fear of my family's relentless scheming was completely gone. The heavy, toxic chain that had tethered me to their endless demands had been permanently severed. My purse vibrated sharply against my thigh. The digital blockade was being tested. I reached into my bag and pulled out my phone. The screen was lighting up with frantic, rapid-fire notifications. Brittany was calling me back to back, leaving massive, frantic voicemails, begging me to come back and explain the documents to her, begging me for financial help now that she knew Jamal was a fraud. Immediately after her calls ended, Diane's number flashed across the screen. My mother was sending rapid-fire text messages alternating wildly between vicious, hateful curses and desperate groveling pleas for me to bail out their foreclosed home. They were panicking. They were drowning in the ocean of debt they had created, and they were desperately reaching out to the only life raft they had left. But I was no longer available for rescue missions. I watched the screen flash with their incoming demands, feeling absolutely nothing but a cold, clinical detachment. They had made their catastrophic choices, and now they had to face the brutal, uncompromising consequences. I opened my phone settings and navigated to my contact list. I clicked on Brittany's name, scrolled to the bottom of her profile, and hit block. I watched her contact profile disappear into the digital void. Next, I clicked on Diane's name. I deleted her frantic text messages without reading them, hit block, and erased her from my phone. I repeated the exact same process for Richard and Jamal. I systematically purged every single trace of their existence from my digital life. I blocked their phone numbers, blocked their email addresses, and ensured my phone carrier would automatically reject any voicemails they attempted to leave. I sat back against the leather seat of the taxi and watched the vibrant city lights blur past the window. I had executed the absolute perfect defense. My lake house was safely locked behind an anonymous corporate entity. My professional reputation was secure. My finances were entirely protected. I had walked into a hostile ambush and completely dismantled the attackers using their own undeniable public records. I had protected my peace at all costs. When the taxi pulled up to my building, I paid the driver and walked through the grand lobby. The night concierge greeted me warmly, completely unaware that I had just successfully neutralized a financial fraud. I slept peacefully as the countdown to ruin started. Exactly 2 months passed since that explosive night at the steakhouse. While my family's world was rapidly unraveling, my own life became a masterclass in peace and prosperity. The profound silence that followed my digital blockade was the greatest gift I had ever given myself. Without the constant draining demands of my mother and the toxic drama of my sister, my energy reserves were entirely full. I channeled every single ounce of that renewed, powerful focus directly into my demanding career as a senior financial auditor. I took on the most complex, high-stakes corporate accounts my firm had to offer. My days were filled with relentless precision, identifying operational risks and securing millions in compliance savings. I led a massive internal audit for a multinational logistics company, discovering a pricing inefficiency that saved the client $4 million in a single quarter. I worked with a level of clarity and ruthless efficiency that left the senior partners completely stunned. My ability to dissect intricate financial discrepancies and present bulletproof compliance strategies made me an invaluable asset to the executive team. Because I no longer had an estranged father showing up in the lobby to scream at me, my professional reputation soared to new heights. 6 weeks after the disastrous dinner, my department manager called me into the main glass conference room. She slid a thick bound contract across the polished table and offered me a brilliant smile. I was officially promoted to Senior Audit Director. The promotion came complete with a massive salary increase, a substantial performance bonus, and my own corner office, overlooking the Chicago River. I signed the contract with absolute certainty. The promotion was the ultimate validation of my independence. I had built a thriving, lucrative life relying solely on my own intellect and unyielding work ethic. I celebrated that evening by driving up to my lake house in Wisconsin, pouring a glass of crisp white wine, and watching the sunset over the water from my private deck. The property was safe, my career was flourishing, and my future was entirely my own. But while I was rising to the top of my corporate ladder, the people who had tried to destroy me were hitting rock bottom at a terrifying speed. I did not need to unblock their phone numbers to know exactly what was happening to them. As a financial auditor, I simply let the public records tell me the story. Every Friday evening, I would sit at my kitchen island with a cup of coffee and pull up the county court dockets to monitor their progress. I watched the dominoes fall, one devastating legal filing at a time. The first major structural collapse hit my parents. Diane and Richard had drained their entire financial foundation to bail out a criminal, and the predatory lending group they used showed absolutely zero mercy. The commercial bank officially filed for immediate foreclosure on their primary Chicago residence just 4 short weeks after our catastrophic dinner. The legal notices were a matter of public record. I read the documents, detailing their severe default, the staggering late fees, and the complete acceleration of their massive debt. They tried to fight it, filing desperate motions for extensions and hardship allowances, pleading with the judge for more time. They hired discount lawyers to file frivolous appeals, hoping to delay the inevitable seizure of their property. But the math was entirely unforgiving. They simply had no money left to give, and the private equity firm wanted their collateral. The court ruled in favor of the bank with brutal efficiency. Exactly 50 days after they tried to steal my lake house, a county sheriff walked up the manicured pathway of the home I grew up in and taped a formal eviction notice directly to the front door. They were officially given exactly 2 weeks to vacate the premises before the property would be seized, locked, and auctioned off to the highest bidder. My mother's absolute worst nightmare was materializing in broad daylight for the entire neighborhood to witness. They were losing everything they had spent 30 years building. The loss of the house was only a symptom of the true disease. The real cancer destroying their lives was Jamal, and his reckoning was far more severe than a simple eviction. The federal authorities finally dropped the absolute unrelenting legal hammer. I logged into the federal court database and found the official indictment. Jamal was formally charged with multiple counts of wire fraud, securities fraud, and money laundering by the United States Department of Justice. The Securities and Exchange Commission successfully petitioned a federal judge to seize every single remaining bank account tied to his name or his shell companies. The financial freeze was absolute and immediate. His luxury vehicles, the same ones he used to parade his fake success at family gatherings, were swiftly repossessed by the banks right out of his driveway in the middle of the afternoon. The neighbors watched in stunned silence as the tow trucks hauled away the physical manifestations of his lies. His flashy designer watches and custom suits were worthless against the crushing weight of federal criminal charges. He was staring down a mandatory minimum sentence in federal prison, and he knew he had absolutely no way out. He had no more wealthy in-laws to drain, and his wife was completely broke. Facing the terrifying reality of life behind bars, Jamal made his final, cowardly move. He completely abandoned his own family. According to the police reports filed in the local system, Jamal emptied the last few hundreds of dollars from a hidden cash reserve, packed a single duffel bag in the middle of the night, and fled the state of Illinois entirely. He became a ghost, leaving Brittany waking up in an empty bed completely alone to face the furious creditors, disgruntled investors, and federal agents knocking on her door. He abandoned his own 7-year-old daughter Kinsley without a single glance backward or a penny to her name. The arrogant, boastful man, who had sat at an upscale steakhouse and ordered $1,000 bottles of wine, was now a desperate fugitive running from the federal government. The resulting social fallout was absolutely undeniably biblical. Diane had spent her entire adult life cultivating an image of elite, untouchable wealth. She judged her friends, looked down on her neighbors, and treated anyone outside her tax bracket like dirt. When the news of Jamal's federal indictment broke in the local business journals, and the foreclosure of her home became public gossip at her precious country club, her social circle turned on her with breathtaking speed. The wealthy friends she had spent decades trying to impress completely ostracized her. They deleted her phone number from their contact lists and removed her from the elite neighborhood association boards. Her club membership was quietly revoked due to unpaid dues and the sheer scandal surrounding her son-in-law. People she thought were her closest allies crossed the street to avoid speaking to her. Invitations to charity galas and upscale dinners instantly vanished. She was publicly shamed, utterly humiliated, and entirely bankrupt. The facade was shattered into a million irreparable pieces. The isolation she felt must have been absolutely suffocating, a direct reflection of the coldness she had always shown to me. With no money, no social standing, and no wealthy friends willing to offer them a lifeline, the family had absolutely nowhere left to turn. They were forced to sell their remaining furniture, their appliances, and any valuables that were not already seized by creditors just to afford basic survival necessities. I watched the final act of their Chicago downfall through the lens of a neighbor's security camera footage that had been shared on a local community forum. My once arrogant parents and my devastated abandoned sister were reduced to packing their pathetic, meager belongings into a cheap, battered rental moving truck. There were no professional movers. There was no luxury staging or graceful exit. It was just Richard, his face gray and haggard, struggling to lift heavy cardboard boxes while Diane wept openly on the concrete driveway. Brittany stood holding Kinsley's hand, looking completely hollowed out by the grim reality of her husband's betrayal and her own impending poverty. They locked the doors of the foreclosed house for the final time, climbed into the cramped cab of the dirty rental truck, and slowly drove out of the neighborhood they once ruled. They were heading north toward the Wisconsin border, absolutely desperate, financially ruined, and entirely out of options. Their entire world had collapsed perfectly around them, leaving nothing but dust and regret. They possessed no backup plan whatsoever, no safety net, and absolutely nowhere to hide from the devastating consequences of their own toxic greed. Their grand deception had finally caught up to them, stripping away every ounce of their pride and leaving them to face the brutal reality of their shattered lives. That brutal reality arrived at my doorstep on a perfectly crisp, brilliantly sunny Sunday morning. I was sitting on the expansive wrap-around deck of my lake house in Wisconsin, wrapped in a plush cashmere cardigan and sipping a freshly brewed cup of dark roast coffee. The surface of Lake Geneva was completely still, reflecting the vibrant blue sky like a massive mirror. It was the exact kind of peaceful, undisturbed sanctuary I had worked my entire adult life to achieve. There were no demanding corporate clients, no frantic audit deadlines, and absolutely no toxic family members attempting to tear down my self-worth. I had spent the last 2 months reclaiming my energy and enjoying the absolute silence that followed my digital blockade. I took a slow, deep breath of the fresh morning air, feeling a profound sense of gratitude for the fortress I had built. Then the jarring, ugly sound of heavy tires crunching over my private gravel driveway shattered the morning peace. I lowered my coffee mug and stood up, walking over to the wooden railing of the deck. I looked down the long, winding path that led from the main road to my property. A massive, battered yellow rental moving truck was slowly rolling onto my land. The truck was covered in road grime, the engine rattling loudly, and the exhaust coughing out dark plumes of smoke. It was a jarring, incredibly ugly intrusion into my immaculate sanctuary. My pulse quickened slightly, but I did not panic. I knew immediately who was inside that truck. The timing aligned perfectly with the eviction notice I had tracked on the county court dockets. They had been thrown out of Chicago, and they were making their final desperate pilgrimage north. The heavy truck lurched to a halt right in front of my detached garage. The loud screech of the air brakes echoed through the quiet neighborhood. I remained standing on the elevated deck, looking down at the vehicle with the cold, detached observation of a forensic auditor reviewing a ruined balance sheet. The heavy metal doors of the cab creaked open. My father Richard stepped out of the driver's side. I almost did not recognize him. The man who had stormed into my corporate lobby wearing a tailored suit and shouting demands was completely gone. In his place stood an aging, defeated old man. His shoulders were slumped forward, his face was unshaven, and his clothes looked like he had slept in them for days. He walked around to the passenger side of the truck and helped my mother out. Diane stepped down onto the gravel, and the visual impact of her downfall was absolutely staggering. My mother had spent her entire existence obsessing over her elite social status. She never left her Chicago home without perfect hair, expensive makeup, and a designer handbag. The woman standing in my driveway looked entirely broken. Her hair was pulled back into a messy, unkempt knot. Her face was pale, drawn, and completely devoid of makeup, exposing the deep lines of stress and terror that she usually paid thousands of dollars to hide. She looked frail, exhausted, and utterly humiliated. The back door of the extended cab opened, and my older sister emerged. Brittany looked just as devastated as my parents. Her usual arrogant swagger had been completely annihilated by her husband's federal criminal indictment and his subsequent cowardly escape. She looked terrified, clutching her 7-year-old daughter Kinsley by the hand. The little girl looked exhausted and deeply confused, clinging tightly to her mother's leg. They stood together in the shadow of the dirty rental truck, a pathetic, shattered remnant of a family that had once thought they were entirely untouchable. I did not invite them inside. I did not offer a warm smile or a comforting word. I set my coffee mug down on the patio table and slowly walked down the wooden stairs to meet them at ground level. I intentionally stopped on the bottom step, utilizing the physical elevation to maintain a firm, unyielding boundary between us. I stood tall, crossing my arms over my chest, projecting the absolute authority of a woman who was in complete control of her territory. Hailey, my mother, whispered, her voice cracking as she took a tentative step forward. I held up my hand, my palm flat and commanding. I did not speak. I simply held the physical boundary, warning her not to come a single step closer. The sheer coldness of my gesture completely broke whatever fragile composure she had left. Diane let out a loud, agonizing sob. Her knees buckled beneath her and she collapsed directly onto the sharp gravel of my driveway. She did not care about ruining her clothes. She did not care about her precious pride. She fell to her knees and began weeping with absolute unrestrained desperation. These were not the fake, theatrical, perfectly timed tears she had utilized at the upscale steakhouse 2 months ago. These were the ugly, raw, hyperventilating sobs of a woman who had lost absolutely everything. Her elite social circle had abandoned her, her bank had seized her home, and her life was entirely ruined. She was staring into the terrifying abyss of homelessness, and she was begging for her life. "Please, Hailey, I am begging you," Diane wailed, clutching her hands to her chest as the tears streamed down her face. "We have absolutely nowhere else to go. The bank locked the doors. The sheriff made us leave. We lost the house. We lost everything. Please, you have to help us. Just let us stay in the guest rooms. Just for a little while, Hailey. Just until we can figure out what to do. Just until we get back on our feet. I will do anything. I will clean the house. I will cook your meals. Please do not turn us away. We are your family." My father stood behind her, unable to even look me in the eye. He stared at his scuffed shoes, tears silently tracking down his weathered cheeks. The man who had always enabled her toxic behavior was now completely paralyzed by the consequences of it. I looked down at my mother groveling in the dirt. For a brief fraction of a second, I remembered being a little girl desperate for this woman to just look at me with an ounce of pride. I remembered twisting myself into knots, trying to be the perfect daughter, hoping she would finally love me the way she loved Brittany. But that little girl was gone, permanently replaced by a woman who knew that letting this narcissist through the front door would be an act of complete self-destruction. I remained perfectly silent, my expression an impenetrable mask of ice. My lack of immediate submission caused Brittany to panic. My older sister stepped forward, her face twisting into a familiar mask of defensive, entitled anger. She could not accept the fact that I held all the power. Even in her absolute lowest moment of total destitution, she still tried to manipulate the situation to her advantage. She reached down and forcefully pulled Kinsley in front of her, using her own crying, terrified daughter as an emotional human shield. "How can you just stand there and look at us like that?" Brittany shrieked, her voice shrill and accusatory. Jamal ran away. He left us with absolutely nothing. His accounts are seized. The feds are looking for him. Kinsley lost her home. She lost her room. She has nowhere to sleep tonight. Look at your niece, Hailey. Look at her. How can you be so incredibly heartless? You have a massive 5-bedroom house sitting right here. You have plenty of room. You have to show some basic human compassion for this innocent child. You cannot punish Kinsley just because you hate us. Kinsley began to cry louder, shrinking back against Brittany's legs. She was tired, she was scared, and she was being actively utilized as a weapon by her own mother. I felt a sharp, genuine pang of pity strike my chest. I looked at my young niece, knowing she was an entirely innocent victim in this massive financial disaster. She did not ask for a criminal father. She did not ask for a greedy, toxic grandmother. She did not deserve to be dragged up to Wisconsin in a dirty moving truck and paraded around as a bargaining chip for housing. My heart ached for the little girl who was watching her entire world collapse. But my analytical mind instantly overrode my emotional reaction. I knew exactly how parasites operated. If I cracked the door open even a single inch out of pity for the child, the adults would swarm inside and completely infest my sanctuary. A temporary stay for a few weeks would inevitably drag into months. They would establish residency. They would claim squatter rights. They would slowly and methodically drain my financial resources, eating my food, using my utilities, and destroying my mental health. They would transform my peaceful, hard-earned home into the exact same toxic war zone I had spent my entire adult life trying to escape. If I let them in, I would never get them out without a massive, drawn-out legal eviction process. I could not set myself on fire simply to keep them warm. I hardened my heart, locking away the pity in a secure mental vault. I looked away from the crying child and shifted my gaze directly back to my mother, who was still kneeling on the sharp stones of my driveway. Diane was looking up at me, her face streaked with dirt and tears, her hands trembling as she waited for me to offer her salvation. I stood tall on the wooden steps of my beautiful debt-free home. I took a slow, deep breath, pulling the crisp lake air into my lungs. I was no longer the victim of their financial schemes or their emotional abuse. I looked down at the woman who had happily tried to destroy my future, and I prepared to deliver the final crushing blow. I stood still on my porch step. The morning sun cast long shadows across the gravel driveway, illuminating the sheer desperation etched into my mother's face. Diane was still kneeling in the dirt, her hands clutching the air, as if trying to grab hold of a lifeline that did not exist. Behind her, the rusted grille of their dirty rental moving truck seemed to mock the elite, untouchable image she had spent decades cultivating. My father Richard stood paralyzed by his cowardice, his eyes locked onto the ground. He had handed his financial future to a criminal, and now he had nothing left but the clothes on his back. I looked at these people, the architects of my lifelong anxiety, and felt a wave of absolute clarity. The emotional chains that had bound me to their toxic demands were broken. It was time to sweep away the debris. Diane let out another loud, heaving sob. She reached her shaking hands toward my knees, begging me to just let them inside, promising that they would be quiet, that they would stay out of my way. I took a step backward, ensuring she could not touch me. The physical distance reflected the permanent emotional wall I had erected. I let her tears fall against the gravel for a few more seconds, allowing the profound silence of my property to magnify her humiliation. I wanted her to feel the absolute weight of her own catastrophic failures. I looked down at her, my expression completely void of sympathy. I spoke with a quiet, lethal precision that forced her to stop crying and listen. "Do you remember what you told me on this exact driveway 2 months ago?" I asked, my voice cutting through the crisp Wisconsin air like a freshly sharpened blade. Diane froze. Her breath hitched in her throat and a flash of genuine terror crossed her red, puffy eyes. She knew exactly what she had said. The memory hung heavily between us, a toxic ghost returning to haunt her. "You stood right there." I continued, pointing to the exact spot on the driveway where she was currently kneeling. "You looked me in the eye and told me that if I did not sign this house over to you, I was no longer your daughter. You demanded that I surrender my entire future to bail out Jamal, and you threatened to erase me from the family if I refused. You told me I would be dead to you." Diane frantically shook her head, hair falling across her face. "Hailey, no, I was just angry," she stammered, her voice high and panicked. "I did not mean it. I was just stressed. You know I love you. We are family. We have to forgive each other." I let out a harsh, bitter laugh that echoed across the quiet lake. "You meant every single syllable, Diane," I replied, refusing to call her mom. "You meant it when you tried to steal my property. You meant it when you dragged my name through the mud on the internet. And you meant it when you sent my father to cause a public scene at my corporate office. You were absolutely thrilled to throw me away when you thought you had the upper hand." I stepped onto the gravel, towering over her. "You were right," I said, delivering the words with crushing finality. "I am not your daughter anymore. You officially severed that tie the moment you tried to use me as collateral for your fraud. And strangers do not get to live in my house." The words hit her with devastating force. Diane collapsed backward onto her heels, her mouth opening in a silent scream of absolute defeat. She realized the manipulation tactics she relied on for 31 years were useless. There was no guilt left to exploit. There was no desperate inner child begging for her approval. There was only an independent, financially secure auditor who saw right through her pathetic charade. My older sister Brittany stepped forward, her face twisted in a mask of panicked rage. She aggressively pulled her 7-year-old daughter Kinsley in front of her again, digging her manicured fingers into the little girl's shoulders. "You cannot do this to your own niece," Brittany screamed, her voice cracking with desperation. "Jamal ran away and left us with nothing. His accounts are seized by the federal government. Kinsley is completely innocent. She has nowhere to sleep. How can you be so incredibly evil?" I shifted my gaze to my older sister. For my entire life, Brittany had been the golden child parading around in luxury vehicles funded by stolen money, mocking my career and treating me like a second-class citizen. Now her fraudulent husband had abandoned her to face the federal authorities and the angry creditors, completely alone. She was trying to use her own terrified, exhausted child as a human shield because she was too cowardly to face the consequences of her own arrogance. I looked directly at Kinsley, offering the young girl a soft, reassuring smile before locking my eyes onto Brittany with absolute disdain. "Kinsley is innocent." I agreed, my tone sharp and uncompromising. "But she is not my child. She is yours. You are her mother, Brittany. It is time for you to step up and act like one instead of using your own daughter as an emotional weapon to extort housing from me." Brittany gasped, her face flushing a deep, angry crimson. "You married a criminal," I continued, refusing to let her interrupt. "You enabled his flashy lifestyle. You ignored the red flags. You gladly spent the money he stole from innocent investors. And when it all crashed down, you sat back while our parents mortgaged their entire future to bail him out. You created this disaster, Brittany. Now you get to figure out how to survive it. There are shelters in Chicago. There are social services. Go find them. You are not crossing my threshold." My father finally found his voice, stepping out from the shadow of the dirty moving truck. "Hailey, please." Richard pleaded, his hands trembling as he gestured vaguely toward the house. "We have $20 to our name. The bank took the house. We have absolutely nothing left. Just give us a week. We will sleep in the garage." I looked at the man who had actively enabled my mother's abuse for 3 decades. The man who had physically grabbed my arm in the lobby of my corporate headquarters, trying to publicly shame me into signing away my life savings. I felt absolutely zero pity for him. "You made your choice when you handed Jamal $800,000 in cash behind my back," I stated coldly. "You gambled your home on a Ponzi scheme and you lost. Your financial ruin is not my responsibility." I took a deliberate step backward, ascending the wooden stairs, until I was standing securely on my elevated deck. I looked down at the 3 broken, desperate people standing in my driveway. The air felt incredibly crisp and clean. The finality of the moment was deeply intoxicating. I pulled my cell phone out of my pocket and looked at the screen. "You have exactly 5 minutes to back that rental truck out of my driveway and get off my land." And I announced, my voice ringing with absolute unyielding authority. "If that truck is still parked on my property when 5 minutes have passed, I am calling the local sheriff. I will have you all formally arrested and charged with criminal trespassing. Do not test me. I will make the call." The sheer authority in my voice completely shattered whatever remaining fight they had left in them. They knew I was not bluffing. They had seen me lock them out before, and they knew I would gladly do it again. Richard grabbed Diane by the arm, roughly pulling her up from the gravel. She resisted for a moment, her face contorting into an ugly, hateful sneer. "You are going to hell!" Diane screamed at me, her voice hoarse and jagged. "You are going to burn in hell for what you are doing to your own mother. God will punish you for this." I simply smiled down at her, completely unbothered by her venom. But the fire was entirely gone from her words. It was no longer the terrifying roar of a powerful matriarch. It was just the hollow, pathetic screech of a defeated narcissist who had lost her favorite punching bag. Her curses bounced off my impenetrable armor, completely powerless to inflict even a single ounce of guilt. "Let us go, Diane," my father muttered, his voice defeated and exhausted. "It is over. She is not going to help us." He pulled her toward the passenger side of the rusted moving truck, practically shoving her into the cramped cab. Brittany grabbed Kinsley's hand and hurried toward the back seat, her face pale with terror and humiliation. She did not say another word to me. The loud, heavy doors of the truck slammed shut, echoing through the quiet, peaceful neighborhood. I remained standing on the deck, arms crossed over my chest, watching as the engine sputtered and roared to life. A thick cloud of dark exhaust billowed out from the tailpipe. The heavy truck began to reverse the tires, crunching loudly against the gravel as my father navigated the long, winding driveway. They backed out onto the main road, the large vehicle turning around to face the opposite direction. I watched the red glow of their taillights disappear down the winding lake road, fading into the distance until they were out of sight. The air around my property settled back into a state of profound, absolute tranquility. The toxic chain that had tied me to this family for 31 years was permanently, irrevocably severed. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with fresh Wisconsin air. The sun was shining brightly, reflecting off the calm surface of the lake. I was completely free. I turned around, opened the heavy wooden door, and walked back into my beautiful, quiet, and secure home, ready to start my new life. The transition into my new life was remarkably seamless. Without the constant weight of my family dragging me down, I found myself operating with a level of clarity and joy I had never known. But while I was ascending, the legal and financial reality of their choices was finally catching up to them. The final act of their downfall played out publicly over the next few months, broadcast across local news networks and federal press releases. Jamal did not make it very far. His grand escape plan turned out to be just as flawed and incompetent as his business ventures. I was apprehended by federal marshals in a cheap motel in Florida. He had been trying to secure a fake passport, completely unaware that his accounts and communications had been monitored by federal authorities for weeks. The footage of his arrest circulated online. The flashy, arrogant man who used to mock my career was led out of a dingy motel room in handcuffs, wearing a wrinkled shirt and looking absolutely terrified. He sits in a federal detention center awaiting trial for multiple counts of wire fraud, facing decades behind bars. The justice system moved swiftly, freezing every remaining cent he hid away to pay restitution to the investors he so brazenly defrauded. His facade of wealth was permanently shattered, leaving him with absolutely nothing but a prison uniform and his impending sentence. Without Jamal, and without a single dime to their names, my parents and sister faced the absolute bottom of the barrel. Diane, Richard, and Brittany were forced to move into a cramped, run-down two-bedroom apartment on the extreme outskirts of the city. The contrast to their former elite lifestyle was staggering. There were no more country club dinners or luxury vehicles. There was no more bragging about their social superiority. The crushing reality of poverty forced them all into the workforce just to keep the lights on and feed Kinsley. My father, who had once prided himself on his corporate connections, was forced to take a minimum wage job as a night shift security guard at a local warehouse. He spends his nights walking the cold concrete floors, a constant reminder of the comfortable retirement he carelessly threw away. Brittany, who had spent years acting like she was royalty, had to swallow her massive pride and accept a job scanning groceries at a discount supermarket. She faces the grueling reality of manual labor every single day, completely stripped of her designer clothes and her arrogant swagger. And Diane, the woman who valued her elite image above her own daughter, was reduced to answering phones as a receptionist at a low-end dental clinic. Her perfect manicures and salon visits are a thing of the past. Their arrogance was completely broken. The wealthy friends they had desperately tried to impress completely ignored their existence. They were entirely isolated, trapped in a tiny apartment, forced to live with the devastating consequences of their own toxic greed. They had gambled their entire existence on a criminal, and they had lost everything. They were no longer a threat to anyone, just a pathetic echo of the elite family they had pretended to be. While they were busy navigating the miserable reality they had built for themselves, I was busy celebrating the beautiful reality I had earned. Exactly 1 year after I originally purchased the lake house, I decided to host a proper housewarming party. I wanted to overwrite the ugly memories of that first night with something vibrant and authentic. I sent out elegant invitations, but this time the guest list looked entirely different. there were no toxic relatives looking to exploit my assets. There were no arrogant scammers trying to steal my property. I invited the people who had actually supported me, the colleagues who respected my hard work, and the friends who had stood by me when things were difficult. I spent the morning preparing the house, feeling an overwhelming sense of pride. The hardwood floors gleamed, the large windows let in the bright sunlight, and the entire space felt completely secure. I walked through the 5 bedrooms, knowing that each one belonged solely to me. There was no family trust hovering over my head, no quitclaim deed threatening my ownership. The legal shield I had constructed remained absolutely impenetrable. The LLC structure kept my address private and my equity secure. As the afternoon approached, the caterers arrived, setting up a lavish spread of gourmet food and craft cocktails on the expansive deck. The atmosphere was light, joyous, and filled with positive energy. The day of the party was absolutely perfect. The Wisconsin summer weather was warm and inviting, and the property looked spectacular. The private dock was lined with comfortable lounge chairs, and the sound of genuine happy laughter echoed across the water. My firm's managing director attended, raising a glass of expensive champagne to toast my recent promotion and my undeniable success. My closest friends mingled effortlessly, sharing stories and celebrating the peace I had finally found. As the sun began to set, casting brilliant shades of orange and purple across the glassy surface of Lake Geneva, I stood by the wooden railing and looked around at the incredible group of people gathered on my deck. The contrast between this evening and the night I had locked my family out was profound. There was no screaming, no demands, and no emotional manipulation. There was only mutual respect and shared joy. I watched my colleagues discussing their passions and my friends playing games on the lawn. In that profound moment, a beautiful truth finally settled into my heart. Family is not defined by blood or shared genetics. Family is not an obligation you are forced to endure simply because you share a last name. Family is built on respect, safety, and mutual support. The people standing on my deck that evening were my true family. They celebrated my victories without envy. They respected my boundaries without question. They did not view my success as a resource to be drained, but as an achievement to be honored. I had spent 31 years trying to earn a place at a table that was inherently designed to make me feel small. It took a massive betrayal for me to realize that I had the power to build my own table, pull up my own chair, and invite only those who recognized my worth. The lake house was no longer just a financial asset or a real estate investment. It was a physical manifestation of my freedom. Every single room, every window, and every floorboard belonged entirely to me. I had legally and emotionally protected my peace, and the reward was a life filled with absolute joy and undeniable security. I stepped away from the railing and walked back toward the sliding glass doors, joining the warm, glowing light of my living room. I felt a profound sense of gratitude for my analytical mind, my corporate career, and the financial independence that had literally saved my life. I had walked through the fire of their manipulation and emerged completely unscathed. The toxic chapter of my past was officially closed forever. My life was moving forward, filled with endless possibilities and the unshakable knowledge that I would never again allow anyone to compromise my hard-earned sanctuary. I looked out over the deep, calm waters of the lake one last time, letting the cool evening breeze gently brush past my face, and felt truly happy inside. The long journey from the desperate ambush in this very house to the ultimate triumph I was experiencing now had tested every ounce of my strength, but it had also forged an unbreakable resilience within me. I had very successfully audited my own life, removing the liabilities and maximizing the assets that truly mattered. I had learned the most valuable lesson of all: that standing up for yourself is the most profitable investment you can ever make. The peace I felt now was worth every single moment of conflict. The silence of my home is a daily reminder of the victory I secured against the people who tried to destroy me. I am no longer the victim of their greed. I am the architect of my own destiny, and my future has never looked brighter. The water lapped gently against the wooden pylons of the dock, a calm, steady sound that washed away the last lingering traces of my chaotic past. This perfectly beautiful sanctuary was indeed the ultimate payoff for me. Sometimes the trash takes itself out, but sometimes you have to be the one to change the locks. Have you ever had to legally or financially protect yourself from toxic family members? Share your stories in the comments. Do not forget to like and subscribe if you believe in protecting your peace at all costs. Until next time, remember, never set yourself on fire to keep someone else warm.